George Miller, a 72-year-old retired Army veteran, sat quietly on the porch of his home, watching the sun set behind the trees. The evening air was cool, and the quiet seemed to mirror his inner turmoil. At this stage in life, George had more time to reflect, and he couldn't help but notice how distant his son, David, had become. For years, he and his wife, Mary, had worked hard to give their son the best, but now, as they entered their twilight years, they felt the weight of age and the growing divide between them and their child. David, at 45, was living a life that seemed perfect on the outside: a successful business career, a beautiful wife, and 2 children. But George could sense the tension brewing beneath the surface. He missed the days when David would come to visit just to sit and talk. Now, those visits were rare, and when David did show up, he was often distracted, his mind on work or his growing family. Mary, sensing the same unease, tried to reach out to her son, but David seemed increasingly unwilling to engage in anything beyond pleasantries. She began to worry that as they grew older, their son would leave them behind completely. One evening, over dinner, Mary finally voiced her concerns to George. "Do you think we're just an afterthought to David now?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with worry. "I feel like he's pulling away, like we're a burden he doesn't want to deal with." George, his face hardening, replied, "He's busy with his life, Mary. You know how it is. He has a family now. Maybe we're not as central to him as we once were." But Mary wasn't convinced. She had lived her whole life supporting her husband and son, and the thought of losing that connection was unbearable. "But what happens when we're gone?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly. "What if he doesn't even care about this house, about us, when it comes time to make decisions?" George didn't answer immediately, but he felt the weight of her words. He had spent his life protecting his family, and the thought of them being forgotten was something he couldn't shake. The tension between George and Mary began to escalate as Mary grew more determined to reach out to David. She decided that they needed to have a serious conversation, one that would bring everything into the open. She feared that if they didn't address the issue soon, they might lose their chance to repair their relationship with David. One afternoon, Mary called David to come over for a visit. When he arrived, she sat him down and spoke directly, her voice filled with emotion. "David, I know you're busy with your work and your family, but we're not getting any younger. We can't help but feel that you're drifting away from us. You're the only family we have left, and we don't want to be a burden to you." David, visibly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat. "Mom, I'm not trying to distance myself from you. I just have a lot on my plate right now. Work, the kids, it's overwhelming sometimes. But that doesn't mean I don't care about you. It's just hard to balance everything." Mary's heart sank. She had heard these excuses before. "David, we're not asking for much. We just want to feel like we matter to you. We don't want to be left behind." David looked away, his eyes darting nervously. "I don't know what you want me to say. I'm doing my best." At that moment, George walked into the room, sensing the tension between them. He sat down quietly, listening to the exchange. Finally, he spoke. "David, you don't have to do everything on your own. We've always been a family. We need to remember that. But we also need you to be here for us, like we've always been here for you." David, feeling the weight of his parents' words, looked down at his hands. I don't know how to do that anymore." The conversation didn't resolve anything that day, but it set the stage for the difficult decisions and revelations that would come next. The next few days passed with an uncomfortable silence hanging over the Miller household. After the tense conversation between David and his parents, George and Mary couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The dynamic between them all had changed, and it felt like the walls that had once connected them were slowly crumbling. David, however, did not reach out after the conversation. He went back to his life, his mind preoccupied with business meetings and the constant pressures of his responsibilities. But Mary, in her quiet desperation, couldn't shake the fear that their son was retreating further into his own world. She started noticing more signs. David was no longer as involved in the family's activities. He didn't return their calls as often, and when they did speak, his answers were clipped and impersonal. One evening, Mary decided to take matters into her own hands. She reached out to Sarah, David's wife, hoping to get some clarity. Over a cup of tea in Sarah's kitchen, Mary asked gently, "Sarah, is everything okay with David? He seems so distant lately. It feels like he's pulling away from us." Sarah hesitated, her expression guarded. "Mary, you know how it is. David's under a lot of pressure with his business and the kids. But he loves you both. He's just tired, I guess." She paused, her eyes searching Mary's face for any sign of judgment. Mary nodded, but deep down, she wasn't convinced. She felt there was more beneath the surface. The following week, during one of David's rare visits to their home, she made a decision. Mary knew she had to confront him, to ask the questions that had been gnawing at her heart. When David finally came over that week, it was clear from the moment he walked in that the air between them was still thick with unspoken words. Mary wasted no time. As they sat down in the living room, she turned to him with a firm but gentle expression. "David, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me," she began. David shifted uncomfortably, sensing where this conversation was headed. "Why have you been avoiding us?" Mary asked, her voice steady but filled with pain. "I understand you have a busy life, but we're your parents. We've always been here for you. What's changed?" David opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He looked at Mary, then at George, who sat silently across the room. He didn't know what to say, how to explain the distance he had been creating. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "It's not that I'm avoiding you, Mom," David said, his voice tinged with frustration. I just don't know how to deal with everything. The pressure at work is intense. I don't want to drag you into my mess." Mary's heart ached, but she pressed on. "David, we're not asking to fix everything. We're just asking for your time, your presence. Don't shut us out." David's expression softened, but there was still a wall between them. "I'm not shutting you out," he said, his voice quiet. "I just don't know how to be here, how to make things work with you. I don't want to disappoint you." George, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke. "You're not disappointing us, David. We just want to be part of your life. We've always been your support system. But you can't keep carrying everything alone." The words hung heavy in the room. For a moment, David sat in silence, processing his parents' plea. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice cracking. "But I'll try. I will." As the story progresses, David begins to make small efforts to reconnect with his parents. He starts taking time out of his busy schedule to visit, slowly letting down his guard. George and Mary, for their part, open their hearts to him, knowing that rebuilding trust takes time. While the road to healing is not without its challenges, they realize that family can weather any storm as long as they stick together. David's visits became more frequent, and with each one, a small piece of the emotional distance that had once separated him from his parents seemed to fade. It wasn't an immediate fix. There were still awkward silences, still unspoken words, but the tension between them was starting to ease. Mary noticed the small changes first. David would stay a little longer at dinner, would listen more intently when they spoke. George, too, could sense the shift, though he was still cautious, not wanting to open himself completely just yet. One afternoon, David invited his parents to visit his office. Mary was hesitant at first. She wasn't sure if she was ready to step into the world that had become so foreign to her son. But George encouraged her to go, sensing that this might be an important step toward rebuilding their relationship. At the office, David showed them around, introducing them to some of his colleagues. He spoke with pride about his work, his achievements. But Mary could see the strain behind his words. There was something missing in his eyes, something that spoke to the loneliness that still lingered despite the outward success. After the tour, they sat down for coffee, and it was then that David opened up in a way he hadn't before. You know, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he began, his voice quieter than usual. About not being there enough. About how much I've been focused on the wrong things. Mary and George exchanged a glance. They had been waiting for this moment, the moment when David would finally speak his truth. I've been pushing myself so hard, trying to prove something, maybe to myself, maybe to others. But somewhere along the way, I stopped paying attention to what really matters, David continued, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't realize it until I saw how much I've been hurting you both. Mary reached across the table, placing her hand on David's. We just want you to know that we're here for you, always. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. David nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I'm sorry, Mom. I've taken you both for granted. And I've been so blind to what really matters. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try. In that moment, Mary and George felt a wave of relief wash over them. It wasn't the end of the struggle, but it was the beginning of something important: honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to heal. The months following their conversation were filled with slow, steady progress. David made a conscious effort to be present for his parents. He would stop by for lunch, take Mary out for a walk in the park, and spend time with George, talking about old memories. It wasn't easy for David, who had spent years building walls around himself, but he was trying. And that, to Mary and George, was enough. As the seasons changed, so did the dynamic in the Miller household. David began to share more about his life, his fears, his doubts, his struggles with work and family. He realized that his parents, though they had their own burdens, still cared for him deeply. They didn't need him to be perfect, just present. One evening, after a family dinner, David sat down with his parents in the living room. The warmth of the room mirrored the warmth in his heart as he finally said what he had been feeling for so long. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to be the son you deserve. George smiled, a sense of pride filling him. Mary, her eyes moist with tears, reached out and took his hand. We've always believed in you, David. And now, you're showing us that the most important thing is love. Family. As the months passed, the changes in the Miller household were becoming more evident. David was no longer the distant son he had once been. He now made it a point to attend family dinners regularly, even when his work commitments tried to pull him in different directions. He and his parents began to rebuild their bond, brick by brick. Slowly, but surely, the wounds of the past started to heal. One spring afternoon, David invited his parents to the garden. It was a beautiful day, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the sunlight casting soft shadows on the ground. George and Mary sat on a bench, watching David as he tended to the flowers, his hands gentle as he worked. It was a peaceful sight, one that spoke volumes about the healing that had taken place in their relationship. Mary watched her son closely, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. It had taken time, but she could finally see the son she had raised, the son who had once been so full of life and promise, who had now returned to the family with a new understanding of what truly mattered. David turned to them, his hands still covered in soil, and smiled. You know, he said, his voice quiet but sincere, I've been thinking a lot about what we've been through. The distance, the mistakes, and I realize now that the most important thing is time. Time with you, time with family. Mary nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. We've always had time, David. We just didn't know how to use it. But now we do. George, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up. It's never too late to start over, he said, his voice steady but full of wisdom. We've learned that, haven't we? David nodded, his eyes full of gratitude. I've learned a lot over these past few months. And I'm not going to let that knowledge slip away again. As the afternoon sun began to set, the family sat together in the garden, their hearts finally at peace. The storm that had once clouded their lives had passed, leaving behind a calm, clear sky. It wasn't perfect, life never was, but it was real, and it was enough. The changes in David were not just emotional, they were physical, too. He began to take better care of himself, eating healthier, getting more sleep, and even exercising again. The once stressed man who had been perpetually running from one task to the next was now slowing down, savoring the moments of peace he had once ignored. George and Mary, too, felt the weight of the years lifting. They began to travel more, enjoying the simple pleasures of life, visiting old friends, going for walks in the park, and spending long evenings reminiscing about the past. They knew their time together was limited, but they had found a new sense of purpose in their relationship with David. David, for his part, began to make more time for his own personal growth. He joined a photography class, something he had always wanted to do, but had never found the time for. He spent weekends photographing nature, learning to capture the beauty he had once been too busy to notice. The more he engaged with life outside of work, the more he realized that this was the life he had been missing all along, the life that had always been there, waiting for him to find it. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset, David spoke up. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice filled with reflection, "about how much I've missed in life, how much I took for granted. But now I feel like I'm finally seeing things clearly. I'm finally living the life I should have been living all along." George and Mary exchanged a look, both of them feeling the same pride in their son. "We're proud of you, David," George said, his voice full of emotion. "You're not the same person you were when you first left. And that's a beautiful thing." David smiled, his heart full. "Thanks, Dad. Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have gotten here without you." And with that, they sat together in silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. As David continued to reconnect with his parents, the once-faded bonds between them became stronger than ever. He wasn't just visiting for obligatory dinners or meetings anymore, he was truly present. There were long conversations about life, love, regrets, and dreams. David began to realize that the foundation of his success wasn't just the result of his hard work, but also the unwavering support from his family, which he had taken for granted for so many years. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden hue over the landscape, David and George sat on the porch, a quiet understanding between them. George had always been the rock of the family, but David now understood the immense weight that his father had carried over the years. "You know, Dad," David began, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think that success was just about climbing higher, getting more, achieving more. But now, I realize that it's not just about those things. It's about having a foundation, a family that you can count on. Without that, everything else is meaningless." George, looking out over the yard, nodded slowly. "It took you a long time to understand that, son. But you're right. You don't realize the value of what you have until you almost lose it." David glanced at his father, his heart heavy with both gratitude and regret. "I was so focused on the wrong things. I pushed you both away, and I thought that being successful meant I didn't need anyone else." George chuckled softly, his voice warm with affection. "I know, son. We all make mistakes. The key is to learn from them, and more importantly, to make sure that you don't repeat them." David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few years finally lifting. "I want to make sure I never make that mistake again. I want to be here for you and Mom, for my kids, for everyone I love." George smiled, a soft, proud smile. "And that's the first step to truly understanding what it means to live, David." As time passed, the Miller family found new rhythms in their lives. David, now deeply connected with his family, started to think more about the legacy he wanted to leave. He had made a commitment to change, not just for himself, but for his children as well. He didn't want them to grow up with the same pressures and misunderstandings he had experienced. One weekend, David sat down with Sarah, his wife, and discussed their future. "We need to start teaching our kids about what really matters. Success isn't just about what they can achieve. It's about who they are and the relationships they build." Sarah smiled, watching David with admiration. I think you're right. We've spent so much time chasing after things that we forgot what we have right in front of us. Our children deserve to know the value of family. David smiled back, a sense of peace settling in his chest. Let's teach them to appreciate the small moments, the simple joys. Those are the things that will last. Later that day, David took his children on a trip to the park. They spent the afternoon playing games, talking, and just enjoying each other's company. As they sat on the grass, watching the sunset, David realized that this was what he had been missing all along. The beauty wasn't in the material things or the success he had once chased. It was in these moments, the quiet ones shared with the people you love. As they headed home that evening, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that his life had changed, and it wasn't just about making money or being successful anymore. It was about love, family, and creating a life full of moments that mattered. David's journey of self-discovery had only just begun. As he continued to spend time with his family, he realized that this was a lifelong process. It was not just about the changes he had made in the past few months, but about the commitment to being a better man, a better father, and a better son for the rest of his life. One evening, as he sat with his parents, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would never stop learning, never stop growing, and never stop cherishing the people who mattered most. I've learned so much, David said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. And I know I still have a lot to learn. But I promise I will keep doing my best for all of us. George and Mary smiled at him, their eyes full of pride. That's all we ever wanted, son, George said, his voice filled with warmth. For you to be happy and to find what truly matters. David nodded, a deep sense of peace washing over him. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally on the right path. As the months continued to pass, David and his family found themselves at a new crossroads. The foundation of their relationship was stronger, but life was always throwing new challenges their way. David had learned the importance of family and relationships, but as he worked on maintaining these bonds, he began to realize that there were still many unanswered questions within himself. What kind of legacy did he truly want to leave for his children? What were the values he wanted to instill in them? David started to take a deeper look at his own upbringing, reflecting on the lessons his parents had taught him, both good and bad. He had always admired his father for his strength and resilience, but now that he was a father himself, David wondered whether he was passing down the right lessons. He wanted to make sure he didn't repeat the same mistakes. One evening, after a family dinner, David sat down with Mary and George in the living room, the three of them enjoying a quiet evening together. The children were upstairs, and the house was calm. David broke the silence, his voice thoughtful. Mom, Dad, I've been thinking a lot about the future, he began. About my kids, and the kind of man I want to be for them. George put down his newspaper, his eyes softening. What kind of man do you want to be, son? David paused for a moment, his mind racing with the complexities of fatherhood, his own mistakes, and the journey of self-discovery he was still on. I want to be a good father, the kind of father who isn't afraid to show love, to show that it's okay to be vulnerable. But I also want them to see strength in me. Strength to admit when I've made mistakes and strength to keep going despite them. Mary smiled, her heart swelling with pride. David, I think you're already the father you want to be. What matters most is that you keep learning, keep growing, and that you never stop loving them. David looked at his parents, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He realized that his journey was ongoing, but he was on the right path. There was still much to learn, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally understanding what it meant to be truly present. In the years that followed, David's life continued to evolve. He remained deeply committed to his family and his personal growth. The bond between him and his parents remained strong, and the lessons he had learned were constantly guiding him. But as life often does, it presented new challenges. David's work life began to require more of his time again. His company was expanding, and with that came greater responsibilities. He knew the temptation to slip back into old habits, working long hours and sacrificing family time, was always there. But this time, he was determined not to let that happen. He took more conscious steps to balance work and family, even if it meant making hard decisions at work. David set boundaries, telling his colleagues that family time was non-negotiable. His boss, understanding the change in his priorities, was supportive, and David found that his new approach didn't make him any less successful. It actually made him more focused and effective at work. One day, as he walked home from work, David realized that he was living the life he had always wanted, one that was balanced and rich in love. It wasn't about being the perfect father, the perfect husband, or the perfect man. It was about being present, being real, and knowing that every small moment mattered. At home, Mary was preparing dinner when David walked in, his face lit up with a genuine smile. He walked over to her, kissed her on the cheek, and said, "I'm home. And today, it's a good day." Mary, with a smile of her own, replied, "Welcome home, David. It's always a good day when you're here." As the seasons changed, so did the dynamics in the Miller household. David's commitment to his family remained unwavering, but he also learned to embrace the changes that life inevitably brought. One of the biggest changes was the arrival of a new chapter in his personal life, a new project at work that required even more of his attention. He was excited about the opportunity, but he was also cautious. He didn't want the lessons he had learned about balance and prioritization to be lost in the rush of his ambition. One evening, David sat down with Sarah in their living room, sipping coffee together. The kids were in bed, and for the first time in a while, they had some quiet time to themselves. "Sarah," David began, "I've been thinking a lot about the balance in my life lately. I've made so much progress, but I know the road ahead won't be easy. This new project is really exciting, but I'm nervous about losing the balance I've worked so hard to find. What if I slip back into my old habits?" Sarah put down her cup and looked at him, her eyes full of understanding. "David, I've seen how much you've changed. You're not the same person you were a few years ago. You've learned how to put your family first, how to protect those relationships. And I believe you can handle this new challenge while still keeping what matters most in focus." David smiled, grateful for Sarah's unwavering support. "I hope you're right. It's just hard sometimes, you know? I don't want to go back to where I was before, chasing success at the expense of everything else." Sarah reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to choose between success and your family, David. You've already proven that. Just remember to take a step back and breathe when you need to. We're in this together." David nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that life would always be filled with challenges, but with the right mindset, he could continue to grow and evolve without losing sight of what truly mattered. As the year went on, David's commitment to his work, his family, and his own growth continued to thrive. He set boundaries at work, made time for his children, and strengthened his bond with Sarah. Each day was a reminder that no matter how busy life became, there was always time to pause, reflect, and enjoy the present moment. David had always been driven by his career, his ambition, and his desire to succeed. But as time passed, he began to realize that the things that truly mattered in life weren't the accolades or the promotions. It wasn't the size of his house, the brand of his car, or the amount of money in his bank account. What mattered were the people he loved, the moments he shared with them, and the lessons they taught him along the way. He started spending more time with his children, engaging in their lives, playing games, reading stories, and listening to their dreams. He wanted them to understand that success wasn't about what you had, it was about who you became and how you made the world around you better. One Saturday afternoon, as they sat in the living room, David gathered his children around him. "I want to tell you something important," he said, his voice calm but serious. "Success isn't about what you have or how much you can achieve. It's about the people you love and the way you treat them. It's about making sure you're there when they need you and giving them your best self every single day." His eldest daughter, Lily, looked up at him with curious eyes. "But, Dad, what if we don't have everything we want?" David smiled softly, pulling her into his arms. "Sweetheart, you'll never have everything you want, but if you have the people you love, that's all that matters. Because in the end, it's love and kindness that will carry you through life." David's life was far from perfect. He had faced struggles, made mistakes, and experienced moments of doubt. But through it all, he had learned the true meaning of success. It wasn't about having it all, it was about loving fully, being present, and cherishing the moments that matter most. In the years ahead, David continued to grow, both as a person and as a father. His family remained his top priority, and he passed down the lessons he had learned to his children. He taught them that success wasn't measured by material wealth or accomplishments, but by the love and kindness they shared with others. One day, as David sat in the living room, surrounded by his family, he looked around with a heart full of gratitude. The struggles of the past had shaped him into the person he was today, but it was the love of his family that had carried him through it all. And as the sun set outside, casting a warm glow over the house, David knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the years passed, the lessons David had learned became ingrained in the way he lived his life. The balance he had worked so hard to achieve wasn't a destination, it was an ongoing journey. He had learned that life was about making conscious choices, day by day, to prioritize the people and things that truly mattered. He had learned to pause, reflect, and make time for the moments that brought joy, peace, and love into his life. One afternoon, David found himself sitting alone in the quiet of his home, gazing out the window as the sunlight poured in. His children were at school and Sarah was out with friends. It was a rare moment of solitude, but instead of feeling lonely, David felt a deep sense of peace. He thought about the path he had walked, the mistakes, the regrets, but also the triumphs, the love, and the growth. He thought about how far he had come, from a man who was consumed by ambition to a father who understood that success was defined not by what you achieved, but by the love you gave and the relationships you nurtured. As he sat there, David realized that this was the life he had always wanted. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The imperfections, the struggles, and the challenges were all part of what made it meaningful. He knew there would be more obstacles ahead, but he was no longer afraid of them. He had the strength, the wisdom, and most importantly, the love of his family to carry him through whatever came next. Later that evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, David looked around at his loved ones. His children were laughing, Sarah was smiling, and Mary and George sat across from him, their faces filled with warmth and pride. It was in these moments, these simple, everyday moments, that David realized the true value of life. "I've learned so much," David said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "And I want you all to know that no matter what happens, I'm here. I'm here for each of you every day." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "And we're here for you too, David. Always." David smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. It was in the love and connections that bound him to his family, in the quiet moments of reflection, and in the knowledge that no matter what life threw their way, they would face it together. Years passed, and David continued to evolve, both in his personal and professional life. His children grew older, and with each new chapter, David found himself learning more about the delicate balance between ambition and family. He had learned that success wasn't just about what he accomplished, it was about the relationships he cultivated and the way he showed up for those who mattered most. One day, while preparing to take a trip to the beach with Sarah and the kids, David paused, taking in the moment. He realized how much he had changed, how much his priorities had shifted. The ambitious man he had once been was still there, but he now knew how to balance his drive with love, family, and the simple joys of life. As they stood on the beach, the waves crashing gently against the shore, David stood beside Sarah, watching their children play. He knew that life would continue to change, that there would always be new challenges and opportunities. But he also knew that with his family by his side, he could face whatever came next. "Do you think we'll ever truly have it all figured out?" Sarah asked, looking up at him. David smiled, taking her hand. "I don't think we're supposed to figure it all out. I think we're just supposed to live it fully together." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, David knew that this was the life he had always dreamed of, a life of love, family, and the quiet certainty that no matter what came next, they would always face it together. As the years passed, life continued to present its challenges, but David's ability to navigate them with grace, wisdom, and love never faltered. He and Sarah, along with their children, grew together in ways he had never imagined. The once distant and ambitious man had transformed into someone who understood that true success wasn't about external achievements, but about internal peace and deep connections. One rainy afternoon, when the whole family was gathered in the living room, a surprise came their way. David's eldest daughter, Lily, who was now in her teenage years, sat down next to him. With a nervous glance, she handed him a small envelope. "Dad," she said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about the future, and I wanted to tell you something. I'm planning to apply to a few colleges far away from here. I know it's a big step, but I think it's time for me to take it." David looked at the envelope and then at Lily. The weight of her words hit him, and in that moment, he felt a mixture of pride and sadness. His little girl, who had once depended on him for everything, was now preparing to take on the world on her own. He opened the envelope slowly, his fingers trembling slightly. Inside, there was a letter from one of the colleges she had applied to. It was an acceptance letter. Lily had been accepted to one of the top universities in the country. David swallowed hard, his emotions overwhelming him. Sarah, who had been watching from across the room, joined him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. "I knew this day would come," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I didn't realize how hard it would be." Lily smiled, sitting beside him. "I know, Dad. But I want you to know that this doesn't change anything. You'll always be my dad, and I'll always need you." David smiled, fighting back tears. "I'm so proud of you, Lily. This is just the beginning of your journey, and I know you'll do great things." As Lily hugged him, David realized that this was another moment of growth for him, too. His daughter was stepping into the world, and though it was bittersweet, he knew it was part of life's natural progression. He had done his job as a father, and now it was time to let go, just a little. Years later, as the children continued to grow and create their own lives, David and Sarah found themselves with more time for each other. The house was quieter, and the once busy household was now filled with moments of peaceful solitude. Despite the joy of seeing their children step into the world, David couldn't help but feel the sting of emptiness. Sometimes his role as a father, once all-encompassing, had changed. One day, David decided to take Sarah on a trip. It was something they had talked about doing for years, just the two of them, away from the responsibilities of everyday life, to revisit their past and look forward to their future. They spent a week in a small coastal town, walking along the beach, enjoying the quiet, and talking about everything and nothing. The trip allowed them to reconnect, to remember what had brought them together so many years ago, and to cherish the life they had built together. On the last day of their trip, as they sat on a bench overlooking the ocean, David turned to Sarah with a smile. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything, for being there with me, for growing with me, for making this journey so worthwhile." Sarah took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to thank me, David. We've done this together, all of it. And I wouldn't change a thing." David smiled, his heart full. The trip had been a reminder of how far they had come and how much they still had to look forward to. Their children were grown, but they would always be a part of the journey, and as they sat on the bench, watching the waves roll in, David realized that the journey was far from over. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the ocean, David knew that no matter where the road led them, they would continue on it together, side by side. Years passed, and David and Sarah entered a new phase of their lives. Their children, now adults, had begun their own journeys, pursuing their dreams, building families, and finding their place in the world. The house, once bustling with the sounds of young children, was quieter now. Yet the silence was not empty. It was filled with memories, with the warmth of all the years they had shared. David often found himself reflecting on the passage of time. As much as he embraced the present, he couldn't help but feel the pull of the past. There were still moments when he wished he had done things differently, spent more time with his children when they were younger, been more patient during the struggles, or maybe had more courage to face some of the fears that once held him back. But then, he remembered the lessons he had learned over the years. The mistakes had shaped him, but they didn't define him. One sunny afternoon, David and Sarah decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood where they had first met. It was a walk down memory lane, a journey that took them past the places that had shaped their early years together. The small cafe where they had their first date, the park where they'd spent countless hours watching their children play, and the bench by the lake where they had shared their hopes and dreams for the future. As they walked, David realized how far they had come. It wasn't just the physical distance from their old home, but the emotional journey they had taken together. The ups and downs, the joys and struggles, they had weathered it all, side by side. "I remember when we first moved here," David said, his voice filled with nostalgia. "It feels like a lifetime ago." Sarah smiled, looking at him with a knowing glance. "It was, wasn't it? But all of those moments, all of those years, they've led us to this point. And I wouldn't change a thing." David nodded, his heart full. They had been through so much, and yet here they were, still walking together. The world had changed, they had changed, but some things remained constant: the love they shared, the bond that had only deepened over time. As they reached the bench by the lake, they sat down together, watching the ripples on the water. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape. It was one of those perfect moments, the kind that makes you realize how precious time is. The past, present, and future all seemed to come together in that one beautiful moment. "We've lived a full life, haven't we?" David said quietly. "Yes," Sarah replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "And the best part is, it's not over yet. We still have so much ahead of us." David smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. He knew that the journey wasn't over. There were still many roads to travel, many adventures to be had, and many moments to cherish. And as long as he had Sarah by his side, he was ready for whatever the future held. With each passing year, David continued to find joy in the simple moments of life. He and Sarah had learned to savor the quiet mornings, the late-night conversations, and the joy of watching their children find their own paths. But David was also aware that time was precious, and he had learned the importance of being present for those who mattered most. One day, as David sat in the garden, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had lived a full life, one that was rich with love, learning, and growth. There had been struggles, of course, but each one had shaped him into the person he was today. The garden, once a place of peaceful solitude, now felt like a symbol of his journey, a place where he had grown, nurtured, and watched as life blossomed around him. The trees, once young saplings, now stood tall and strong, just like the family he had built with Sarah. "I never thought I'd be here," David said to Sarah one evening as they sat together in the garden. "I never imagined that this would be my life. But now, looking at everything, I realize that it's exactly what I needed. All of it." Sarah smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "And you've made it all happen, David. You've created a life full of love, of connection, of family. We've created this together." David looked at her, a smile crossing his face. "Together," he echoed softly. "Always together." As the years unfolded, David began to see the fruits of all the hard work, growth, and love that he and Sarah had cultivated over the decades. Their children had gone on to create lives of their own, each of them carving their unique paths. And yet, despite the distance that time and geography sometimes created, the bond between them all remained unbreakable. It was a family rooted in love, respect, and the shared memories of a life well lived. David often found himself reflecting on his role as a father. In the early years, he had been consumed with providing for his family, climbing the career ladder, and trying to prove his worth. He had spent so much time worrying about success, achievement, and external validation that he hadn't realized how much of the simple, beautiful moments had slipped through his fingers. Now, as he sat in the same garden where he had spent so many years watching his children grow, David finally understood what it truly meant to be a father. It wasn't about the grand gestures or the accolades. It was about being present, showing up day after day, and being there for the people who mattered most. One evening, as he and Sarah sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, David turned to her, his voice filled with emotion. "I think I finally get it," he said quietly. "Everything I've worked for, everything I've chased after, it wasn't really what mattered. It's all been about the moments we've shared, the love we've built, and the family we've created." Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "It took time, but you've always known, David. You've always known that love was the most important thing." David nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I just wish I had understood it sooner. I wish I had been more present when they were little. I was so focused on providing, on being successful, that I missed out on some of the most important moments." Sarah gently wiped the tear from his cheek. "You did the best you could. And now, look at where we are. Look at the life we've built. It's not perfect, but it's ours. And it's beautiful." David took a deep breath, the weight of his emotions lifting. "You're right. I've spent so much time looking back, wishing for what I missed. But I think it's time to look forward, to cherish what we still have and the memories we've made." As they sat there, the warmth of the setting sun surrounding them, David felt a deep sense of peace. He had come full circle. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had also been rich with love, family, and the kind of success that mattered most. He smiled at Sarah, knowing that, together, they had built something truly special. And for the first time in his life, he felt content with the path they had taken and the road that still lay ahead. David's story was one of growth, learning, and rediscovery. Through the years, he had learned to let go of his need for external validation and had come to understand the importance of living authentically, loving deeply, and cherishing the people around him. His journey had not been easy, but it had been meaningful. The love of his family had been his anchor, his strength, and his source of peace. As he and Sarah looked ahead, they knew that the next chapter of their lives would be filled with new adventures, new opportunities, and more moments to cherish. They weren't looking for perfection. They had already found it in the imperfect, everyday moments they shared together. David had learned that life wasn't about the destination, but the journey. And in this journey, he had found his true purpose. With Sarah by his side and his family's love as his foundation, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. As they stood together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, David whispered softly, "The journey never ends, does it?" Sarah smiled, her hand in his. "No, it doesn't. But as long as we're together, that's all that matters." And with that, they faced the future with hearts full of hope, knowing that whatever challenges or joys awaited, they would always face them as one. Years went by, and the once bustling household of David and Sarah had quieted. The children had grown into successful young adults, each charting their own paths. Yet, despite the changes, David and Sarah's love remained as strong as ever. They had built something enduring, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, steadfast love that had guided them through all the twists and turns of life. As they sat together one evening, their hands intertwined, watching the last rays of sunlight dip below the horizon, David realized that he had everything he had ever truly needed. His life had been a series of chapters, some filled with challenges, some with triumphs, and some with moments of deep reflection. But in the end, it wasn't about what he had accomplished. It was about the love that had surrounded him, the family that had been his anchor, and the memories he had made along the way. "Sarah," David said softly, his voice filled with gratitude, "I think I've always had what I needed. The love of a family, the joy of watching our children grow, and the peace of knowing we've walked this journey together. That's everything." Sarah looked at him, her smile warm and filled with understanding. "We've built something beautiful, David. Not perfect, but beautiful. And it's ours." David smiled, feeling the weight of the years slip away. The road ahead was still unknown, but he knew one thing for sure: with Sarah by his side and the love of their family, he was ready to face whatever came next. Together, they had created a life full of meaning and connection, and that, David realized, was the greatest success of all.